Thank you, Piero. Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for being around this time of the day. I do apologise for the temperature in this room. We've opened a few windows, which is probably not very efficient when it comes to the air conditioning that does exist. So hopefully it's manageable for you. But again, thank you for being here. I would start by observing that I started my career in the late 1960s, where I worked specifically in places where people were not. I also worked largely on areas that were formally protected. There were islands around New Zealand. And it's with some irony that I notice now I'm in a conference giving an address on a community-based approach to conservation. And I would observe that many of my colleagues, some of whom are in the room here, would also agree with me. Firstly, that I have no skills in dealing with people. They probably don't either. And it's probably one of the biggest challenges I think that I've noticed in 40-something years career in conservation so far, is that I just wish I had more skills in sociology and economics in the areas that concern people more than biodiversity generally. So in my ignorance, I'm giving you an address this afternoon on what I call a community-based approach to conservation. And I'm using the word community in both senses, in the sense of biological communities of plants and animals interacting at the same place, and also people who interact with each other in the same place, and of course interact with plants and animals often. And my focus this afternoon is on invasive alien species, because that's what the session is about, and that's where most of my background has been. And I'm focusing in particular case studies on islands in the Pacific. And I'm going to be using 6 case studies to identify a few case studies that have been brought to my attention, or that I've actually worked out for myself. And when we talk about invasive species, it can be indeed from microbes to mammals. We could have even included Ebola in here perhaps. But one of the things I think we all know in this room is that there is a myriad of invasive species which are becoming of increasing attention to us as we try and manage biodiversity. But increasingly we're also discovering that people managing invasive species may have other interests in doing so. And these are the social and the economic, even the religious reasons which us as biologists or ecologists perhaps haven't really recognised perhaps in the past. And indeed, it's my thesis that integrating environmental, social and economic outcomes in the design of invasive species projects is probably the key to further success. In my first case study, I'm looking at the kakarori, a very special endemic passerine living in Rarotonga in the Cook Islands. And this is an example of a partnership involving a small number of passionate Kiwi practitioners who have built on success on islands around New Zealand and took that to the Takatumu Conservation Area, which happens to be a private, protected area, protected by the landowners. And I'd like to acknowledge Ian Karika, who is sitting in the room here, one of the landowners of the Takatumu Conservation Area. Here is a conservation champion for the Pacific. Thank you for coming, Ian. I appreciate you being here. If there are any questions about the Takatumu Conservation Area and the work on the kakarori, then Ian is just exactly the right person to be talking to. He's also got his colleagues from the Cooks here with him. The key thing I think about that partnership in the Cooks is a combination of commitment, indeed aroha, as we would call it, love, and a partnership between these practitioners who knew what needed to be done and the landowners who empowered it to be done. And the feature now is that this has been going for, what, nearly 20 years, more than 20 years actually, is how do we keep it going? 20 years is probably longer than most conservation projects, most control projects have been able to sustain the outcomes. So this project in the Takatumu Conservation Area is already a headline project that has gone much longer than most control projects. I noticed, by the way, the use of the control being used variously. It's really important that we define those words. Controls are very different objective from eradication, as indeed the people of the Takatumu Conservation Area could tell you. But the bottom line is success, and you'll see in this sort of a graph, it's a sort of graph that all biologists love to see, certainly all conservation managers love to see, is an increase not only in each age class of kakarori, but also increase in the overall numbers of kakarori, which nearly went to extinction just 20-something years ago. So much so has the success been that they've now been able to move a sample of these birds to another island in the Cooks as an insurance population, to Atu. And again, I acknowledge and celebrate with the landowners, and with all those involved. The question now is, how do we keep it going? These people are getting old, let alone tired. How do we find the new generation? Where's the next generation of conservation practitioners for control projects like this? A second case study comes from Fiji, an island called Viwa, where I think it's a model of adapting best practice, just as it was adapted at the Takatumu Conservation Area in Rarotonga. So too was classic best practice in rat control through the Pacific Invasives Initiative and the University of the South Pacific, working again with the landowners, with the residents of Viwa Island in Fiji. The challenge here, or the opportunity seen by the University of South Pacific, was to eradicate cane toads in order to benefit an endemic ground frog, one of only 4 populations remaining. A bold move, and indeed nobody has eradicated cane toads, even the Aussies that I know of. And so this would have been a world first, and very difficult indeed. Interestingly, in discussion with the landowners, with the residents of Viwa, and there are only just over 100 of them, they agreed that cane toads were a nuisance, but rats were more so. And so the arrangement came through good dialogue and good discussion that they would eradicate the rats first. And if they could keep the rats off after a successful eradication for 2 years, then we would consider going to the much more difficult exercise of eradicating the cane toads. And there was a great plan which made me laugh, I must say. I won't go into it, with how to eradicate cane toads. And no, it didn't involve golf clubs. So the adaptation of best practice in this case, and you can see a few examples of it here. Never mind the fancy GIS, a flip chart on the wall of the hall was what did it, with colouring pens to show whose area was what in terms of baiting, remembering that eradications are very precise, all or nothing exercise, so you couldn't afford to miss any areas. And over a period of 6 weeks, all the men of the island eradicated the rats from Viwa, so a fantastic success. We took the opportunity 6 months later to have an independent organisation go in and review, to talk to the locals about what the outcomes were of that eradication. Interestingly, 30% more taro. This is the staple diet of the people of the island. Just 6 months later, almost hard to believe. Also, the public health nurse who came once a week no longer had to come, at least not as frequently, because there were not the waterborne diseases and the children weren't getting ill. Just 2 mind-boggling examples, to us at least, of the impact that rats have without us really realising. There were a number of other reported fascinating accounts of more fish for around the island, for example. Turned out that our logic was all the men were fishing for 6 weeks. And 6 months later, they could still see the difference in the fish population. Makes one think about traditional fishing practices, doesn't it? However, from the other side of it, not all the residents were happy with that eradication, and it turns out that some of their children had not been employed, in fact, on the eradication. And indeed, rats are now back on Viwa, whether they got back there by themselves, which they're perfectly capable of doing, or whether in fact they were assisted there deliberately, we don't know. But interestingly, just recently I've been approached again by a representative of the Viwa owners to have another go at eradicating the rats from Viwa. Just an example of the social dimensions that aren't always obvious, and certainly won't be obvious if you don't consult. In the third case study, this is an area called Montpanier, which is a formerly protected area in the northeast of New Caledonia, where we were engaged by Conservation International to look at the prospects of controlling 5 species of mammal for biodiversity conservation benefits. In early discussion with the tribes around Montpanier, it became clear that while they cared about the biodiversity up on the mountain, they cared more about the pigs in their gardens. They were indeed a gardening culture. And so we very quickly worked out that a more focused approach with 2 projects. One was to determine whether the local people could control rats to very low densities at a landscape scale and keep rats at low densities. And the answer to that was yes, they can. And the second was to see if we could actually find a way of reducing the impacts of pigs in people's gardens, given that they were a gardening culture, which led to all sorts of interesting social ramifications. And I acknowledge Conservation International, who have carried on this work in association with Diubik, which is a collective of tribes in the area who work together. After all, they own this land. And what's really exciting, just recently I was back in New Caledonia and working alongside BirdLife International Partnership, the Pacific Invasives Initiative, and the Ornithological Society of New Caledonia, where they're now focused on this pig control work, mainly for social benefits, but long-term biodiversity conservation benefits. So those are the sorts of changes that need to come from good consultation, a willingness to change your priorities to fit in with the landowners and with the people who actually live on the land. And my fourth case study is in Fiji again, and this is one that's very topical. It's just a project getting underway now. It's related to what we call the giant invasive iguana. It's actually the American iguana, for those of you who know the species, which someone Light and Soul deliberately released into Fiji in about 2000. That is now found on at least 7 islands and is very difficult to locate and may well be on more. And a local NGO called Nature Fiji, Manakitiviti, worked really hard with support from the Conservation International, again, the Critical Ecosystems Partnership Fund and other donors, to raise awareness amongst the local residents out on these islands of the need to control, or ideally to eradicate, this animal. A lot of modelling was done, including by IUCN's Iguana Specialist Group. It's a good example of a specialist group contributing to conservation objectives, where it was quickly determined that unless something was done pretty soon, we're going to go through that eruption phase where there will just be no way that you can ever contemplate eradicating this animal. We don't know a lot about the impacts of iguanas from elsewhere, but certainly the potential is enormous. And it seems they particularly like eating taro, for example, again, right into the staple diet of the people. So the economic and the social implications, let alone the biodiversity implications of this iguana becoming widespread in Fiji, are enormous, although not well quantified. Interestingly, this animal has been in captivity for quite some time, the one that's been released in Fiji, whereas the native iguana, and one of our concerns is for the native endemic Fijian iguanas, typically produce between 4 to 6 eggs per female. We haven't quite topped the 100 yet, but one female of these giant invasive iguanas had 96 eggs. 96 eggs of one female. How are we going to control that? And just the second to last example is one that I know very nice. It's just covered in the other session of invasive species here. At Norfolk Island in the Tasman Sea, actually not too far from here, in fact, part of Australia, is a classic example of of islands epitomising those opportunities and challenges in biodiversity conservation. In particular, it's an inhabited island, which is the cutting edge, as I'm sure we all know, for eradication or for island restoration. Norfolk has a 300 hectare or so national park, which is really the last habitat for a number of endemic forest birds and seabirds. Their rat control and cat control has been struggling along. But a recent initiative by the adjacent landowners, farmers, who would also very much like to see the rats controlled for their economic, agricultural reasons. And now a fascinating, exciting, in fact, just been announced this week, I understand, some funding from the Australian government to support this public-private partnership with a common objective to effectively control the rats for a range of outcomes. Really exciting indeed for Norfolk. And finally, we couldn't go talking about island restoration and invasive species and working with communities without talking about New Zealand, and I apologise for my bias in this, but Tiri Tiri Mātangi is probably a classic in New Zealand. It was until the late 1960s farmed actually by the government, and then with scrapie, I think was the disease that arrived there for sheep. So the sheep were removed, so it was handed across for conservation. And it was the University of Auckland that led the charge in developing a restoration plan based on good biogeographical principles and a planting program. Over 300,000 trees were planted over a period of about 10 years by volunteers who paid for the privilege of going out there, working all day with a spade and shovel, planting and working out of nurseries there with locally sourced stock. Now about 30,000 visitors a year, mainly New Zealanders from Auckland, which is just an hour by boat away, are able to go out there and experience a whole range of endangered species which they would never have had the opportunity to see elsewhere. And I refer to this as the Tiri effect. Not only has it raised awareness amongst average New Zealanders, just ordinary New Zealanders who can get out to Tiri easily as an open sanctuary, not only raised their awareness, but generated much greater support amongst communities for actually dealing with invasive species, which is the key to successful conservation in New Zealand. As a result now, I characterise New Zealand conservation not by the work that DOC, the Department of Conservation, does, and it does a great job, over 30% of New Zealand is responsible for, but the real focus of New Zealand conservation now, what characterises New Zealand conservation is community-led conservation. A great outcome from places like Tiriti, Matangi. Kia ora.